Well, I make that 12 o'clock, so we may as well make a start. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you very much for joining us, and Kevin indeed for his presentation on The Devil is in the Detail. This is the second IHBC South Branch webinar we've done this year, and our intention is to try and do one every other month until normal life returns. The only thing I would add is we would hope to do another one in May, so watch the website for the details, which will be coming out soon. And Kevin has very kindly done a detailed book list to go with this presentation, looking at some key notes and dates as well, which is extremely helpful. And we'll find a way of sending that out to you when we send the details how to link the video that's currently being recorded. So without any further delay, I'll pass over to Kevin, who will run us through his presentation, The Devil is in the Detail. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'm trusting that everyone can hear me. We're starting off looking at buildings in much greater detail, and it's important that we understand what we're looking at with the building, its history, how it's changed, the materials of construction, how it's been put together, and also its status and significance. Well, all this sort of information might seem like a bit of a luxury when you're looking at a historic building, but in fact, the minute anyone wants to do a listed building application or planning applications, one really does need to understand what you're dealing with. And this is, of course, embodied in the legislation that's come out during this this last sort of 20 years or so. And so the main one wants to look at are conservation principles. That guidance came out in 2008, and also the National Planning Policy Framework, which we all should be working to. And these I highlight what heritage value, communal value, historic value, and evidential value. The definition that we're looking at of significance is the heritage, what the heritage interest is to people, and it can be broken down into various areas: archaeological, architectural, artistic, and historic. And we can determine the significance by looking at the building, its fabric and construction, architectural details, but also very important is the sort of social and historic background, and also the way that it reflects developments in building technology. The archaeological interest is not just it's the above ground archaeology, how the building has been changed over the centuries. And each of these changes reflect changes in fashion or the requirements of the owners. And all those changes are quite important, you know, right up to the 20th century. And then the final thing we should be looking at is setting and context. Well, that's a lot to look at in one go, so I propose simply to concentrate today on the historic building analysis aspect. So looking at the building's fabric in detail, looking at the very small details, we're looking sort of forensically at a building, because quite often very small items contribute quite a lot to the story of the building, how it's being changed, evidence for details that are now mainly missing, etc. Also, the building can reflect social and economic change as we go through the centuries, changes in fashion, and also, as far as the materials are concerned, changes in transport. So there are massive changes with the coming of the railways in the middle of the 19th century as far as what materials were available. Buildings ceased to simply reflect the materials of the locality, and it was possible to bring materials in for much greater distances. So looking at the detail is very important. And the sort of loss of the small detail, oh, never mind, it's just a window round the corner. Yes, it's okay to change it to a doorway or whatever. This gradual sort of erosion has an accumulative effect on the significance of the building. And so I know that at times conservation officers are sort of accused of being too precious about detail. But if we're not, we gradually sort of water down the asset, the heritage asset, and we've got less to pass on for the future. So as far as sort of understanding the buildings that you're dealing with, quite often things aren't quite as obvious as they might seem. One has to really look in detail. And a lot of people start with the listed building description. The big problem of that is that historically, the listed buildings description was only sufficient for you to be able to identify the building in a street of buildings. Numbers change, house numbers change, and so a brief description so that you know which building it is that you're dealing with that's listed. That was the main aim. And it's only this last 15 years with buildings being spot listed where Historic England inspectors have been involved that we're actually getting a couple of pages of description now with interiors, etc. Whereas previously, if you got 6 lines, you were very, very lucky. So it's important that we do look in detail at the buildings. So here's a typical sort of listed building description. This one's a big one. It's all of 6 lines, and it's describing this farmhouse, but only what can be seen from the outside, from the sort of public vantage point, or from here. Obviously, someone's managed to get into the back garden to just view the back of the building. But that description in no way can be used as an indication of the building's significance. And when I actually looked at it as it was going to be repaired and brought back into sort of full use again, the description ran to 12 closely typed pages and about 40 photographs to actually illustrate the significance of the building. And what was missing from the listed building description was the development of the interior of the building and also its structure. And so what had been glossed over in the listed building description was really the true age of the building. And a lot of information could be gained by the roof structure, the way that the purlins, these are it's an alternate butt purlin roof, so suggesting a late 16th, early 17th century date. As you went through the building, bits of staircase, bits of panelling, etc., all contributed to that sort of date. On the ground floor, we were into the 18th century sort of upgrading of the building with beautiful panelled doors and panelling, etc. And out the back in the sort of slightly later extensions, one still had the remains of a Victorian kitchen with its coppers, etc. So a very important sort of time capsule at the back of the building there. And all that was missing, of course, from the listed building description. And again, caution, Here we've got something which is simply described as a late Georgian building, and the description mentions the sash windows and how many panes of glass are in the sash windows, etc. But in fact, to the roof structure, etc., we're back into the 1230s. It, in fact, was the refectory to the abbey, and has just simply been cloaked in a later building makeover. So, great caution needed. Again, here, the description of this was a 19th century cottage, but once you get up into the roof, again, quite often the answer lies in the roof. Here you can see the core of the building is in fact medieval. It was a medieval open hall, probably going back into the 14th century, with its timber frame and its well blackened panels, etc., suggesting original open hall with open hearth, etc. Well, not a problem. We've got a date stone. So, of course, we know everything we need to know about the building. Here we are, 1635. And if you look closely at this date stone, it's in a very odd sort of patch in this sort of pebble dash render. And does this building really look like a 17th century building with its 20th century sort of mock Venetian windows and so on and so forth? Well, talking to the owner that had just bought the building, inside had been a facsimile Inglenook fireplace with a very nice fireback dated 1635, and he decided to sort of display this in the apex of the roof. So here we are, the building is masquerading as a 17th century building, and it's in fact a cast iron fireback. So, you know, beware of the obvious. Buildings also evolve through time, and that evolution of the building is very important as far as its significance is concerned. We tend to get very excited about finding a building that's still in its sort of pristine state from the late medieval period or whatever, with very little alterations. But in fact, the building here, this crook frame building, is of great significance because it shows development on the edge of a village here, development from a single bay crook cottage to gradually being heightened as the family extended. The building was extended lengthwise and so on and so forth, but all in timber frame, sort of local materials being used. So we've got there at least 5 or 6 major phases of development covering about 400 years of evolution of the building. So most important, the development of the building. And again, in our sort of search for understanding, and particularly of the small detail, archives may well help. And here we can see in the archives office here, we've got a sketch. This is a gate lodge in the New Forest for Rhinefield House. And it was designed by the architects Romain Walker and Tanner back in 1888. And we're fortunate, we've not only got sort of the basic drawings of the elevations, etc., but right down to the window detail. And this is very important. If someone sort of whipped out the original whatever, it's good to be able to get back to the original details to see how it was originally designed. Or if one's doing a repair of an original window, again, you've got all the details here that's needed. So documentary information, if you're lucky enough to find it, particularly drawings of the building for sort of 19th and early 20th century buildings, can be a great source of information. So let's start and look then at the details of a building. And the logical thing is to start at the top and work our way down, sort of from the... So, stacks, chimney stacks. Well, these not only reflect the period that the building was constructed, but health and aspirations of the original owner, the fashions of the period, etc. And so here we've got everything from quite fine sort of Tudor stacks running through to a very decorative 17th century stack here at Blandford Forum, where the owner obviously, was conspicuously displaying their wealth and prestige in the town. We've then got, the more humble sort of 19th century stacks, and also stacks like this one, which is on a Lutyens building, which is sort of copying loosely the past. And in fact, we find in the 19th century, quite a lot of the large estates started to look back to the Tudor and Jacobean periods, and you get these highly decorative chimney stacks on 19th century estate cottages. And the pots themselves, again, can tell us quite a lot of information. The 18th century chimney pots tended to be hand thrown, and these are typical of southern Hampshire. These were made in Fareham. There were about 30 chimney pot makers in Fareham at the end of the 18th century. They're hand thrown in sections and joined, and they typically have this sort of decorative band around, and the pinched sort of pie crust type top here. Elsewhere, these handmade pots quite often have the name of the maker and his location, which is very nice to find. Very easy to lose this. This is a small detail that's very easily lost. Cracked chimney pot, so up goes the roofer onto the roof, throws it off and sticks back a modern sort of machine-made pot. So you've lost a great link there with the significance of the building. And again here, you can see these very tall pots. Again, these have been thrown in several sections and joined together, sort of handmade ones, these long toms. And then you've got a more recent replacement. This is a machine-made one, very sort of accurate in its profile. And although there's been an attempt to sort of look like the originals, there's not the character, etc. Well, the 19th century coming of the railways meant that materials were easily moved around the country, and things like chimney pots became an important statement of status. And if you really had a fairly deep pocket, you could afford one of these highly decorative pots made by one of the big pottery manufacturers in Staffordshire. And so not only could you dine off their best china tableware, but you also could have one of their fine pots. And we find whole assemblages of pots here, reflecting the coming of the railways from all over the country, on one roofscape. And again, the loss of one or two of these starts to dilute the story. Things like ridge tiles, again, can be quite important. Here on this roof, although it's been retiled several times, some of the original ridge tiles have been reused. And here in the centre, we've got a medieval ridge tile with its pierced work. Alongside it, 17th century ridge tiles, and then the clay tiles themselves are sort of 19th and probably 20th century handmade replacements. So again, we've got a story developing of the changes to this roof. And in the 19th century, this was a period of pattern book materials. And here someone's chosen ridges and finials from a distance from a pattern book being shipped by rail for the roof. And these pattern books from the late 19th century, again, are a great source of detail and information about the changes in the ceramics on roofs. Small detail, again, can tell us a story about a previous use of a building. Here we've got sort of a U-shaped plan of buildings. It's now 4 cottages, but originally it was a stable block to a large house. And the little bit of evidence remains sort of Gothic. Again, one could very easily lose these off the rooftop, and that's the last link, these vent tiles with the stables beneath. It's in the story of the building. The roofing materials themselves, local materials, local use of materials. In many areas where there's decent clay, one had tiles, clay tiles, but then slate coming in via river or canal, and then eventually by rail. So the roofing materials are telling us a story of improved transport and also technology. And then we get into the 19th century, we find these patent tiles. These are London architectural patent tiles, very, very rare indeed. Easy to lose because they're very difficult now to match up with second-hand ones. So one is beginning to lose, you know, whole sort of roof slopes of this sort of material. So important to note the type of materials and also the way that they've been put on the roof. Here, the valley, it's not sort of valley tiles. This is a laced valley. Again, a method that was very popular towards the end of the 19th and early 20th century, particularly on arts and crafts buildings. And when this gets re-roofed, no doubt the roofer will come in, you know, with a crate of valley tiles. It's cheaper and easier, but again, it's lost quite a bit of the character of this particular roofscape. You know, and what about these slates? You know, the way they've been cut, you know, labour costs weren't a problem at that period, but obviously are now, and it's a great part of the character of that particular roof, easily lost. Well, once we get into the roof structure, again, the roof structure can signify the early periods of construction. Usually the roof is one of the last areas to get changed when below the walls decay and are replaced with other materials. The roof structure tends to stay. And so we can have a whole range of roofs with different types of technology for jointing and for the way that they're constructed. From the early roofs with these long, slender members with very simple passing joints, right through to the typical side purlins, these clasped purlins of southern England, to the latest in technology in the late 16th and 17th century, these alternate butt purling roofs. And also regional variations like the crook construction of the roofs. We find a lot in the Midlands and on the western side of the country. They're into Hampshire, but as soon as you start going more east than that, we lose this sort of crook tradition as a different timber frame tradition. So we can have variations in the very way that the timber structures are put together. Things like eaves and cornice details, again, very important. The earlier sort of open eaves like this, quite a fire risk. And after the Great Fire of London, building regulations were brought into force, particularly for London, but gradually creeping out to some of our other major cities, which prohibited these sort of open roofs. And various other ways of closing the eaves were devised with lath and plaster work and eventually brickwork. And these changes were brought about, particularly, as I say, in London. The 1707 London Building Act forbade wooden eaves cornices to be used because of the fire risk. And so this can be very loosely used in the major cities as a method of dating. But as soon as we get out into the countryside, into the towns, you can't. So these examples were all from Blandford Forum in Dorset. The whole town, except this building here, burnt down in 1771. So way past the 1709 date for decorative timber cornices and so on. And yet here, in the rebuild, we've got them until we get into the 1760s with this one, with the brick detail. So be cautious about using the London Building Acts for, in fact, dating the progression of things like cornice details, etc. Other details at roof level, these very highly decorative ones are a devil to sort of repair and keep painted, and you can just see the hint of what's happened next door with these nice fiberglass ones that don't require any repair and care. This is in a conservation area in quite a nice Victorian area of a town, and we've lost quite a lot of the significance of that area due to these changes with the concrete tiles and the fiberglass, etc. The barge boards can be quite a status symbol, and some estates had their own particular design of cottages with decorated barge boards, so there's a great sort of similarity throughout the estate, and the use of polychrome brickwork, etc. So these details, very important to retain. We also get regional variations. This is a seaside town, and this is on top of the bay windows. You've got this sort of gable, but it's glazed in 3 directions to make use of the best views, etc. Windows, again, change through time. Particularly the arches and the openings to the windows and the position where the windows are within those walls. We get particularly in the 18th century, a great use of rubbed brickwork, rubbed and gauged brickwork for arches, window arches, and also other detailing on facades, and particularly for things like the aprons just beneath the windows here on the early Georgian buildings. String courses, again, very popular from the latter part of the 17th century onwards in brickwork. The earliest ones are fairly simple. By the time we're getting to the early 18th century, we're getting quite decorative string courses with sort of fancy terminals at the end. And quite often these are in gauged brick, rubbed and gauged brickwork to give this very fine finish. And again, one has sort of a whole development of these decorative string courses right through to the Victorian period, when we get these these are moulded ones, sort of mass produced. Again, you can buy from a catalogue. It's the equivalent of sort of online purchasing today. And applied decoration, again, in the 18th century, it was the height of fashion to apply this stucco decoration to your fine Georgian buildings in your major towns and cities. And these decorative features, again, very important to record and repair and conserve carefully. And even sort of further down the social scale, these much plainer ones, again, are quite important to really value. Bricks themselves can tell us a story about their manufacture, all the evidence on the surface of the brick for handmade manufacture. The bonds, again, can give us a good idea of date, but also of social status. Here we've got late 18th, early 19th century rat trap bond, where the bricks are turned on edge. This made the bricks go further. You needed fewer bricks for the building. It reflects the coming in of the brick tax, but also building cheap, cheerful housing for your industrial workers, etc. So we tend to find it in lower status buildings, this form of rat trap bond. In higher status buildings, the bricks have been carefully selected, and you get the vitrified headers being used in this Flemish bond pattern to give a highly decorative finish. The most expensive bond of all was the header bond in the brickwork. So one can begin to, just by looking at the brickwork, see a whole range of status. Also, the way that the bricks were fired in the kiln, the way that they were stacked, with the firing marks on the bricks can tell us a lot about the design of the kiln that was being used. And these were more than likely wood-fired kilns that were producing this sort of effect on the brickwork. Also looking closely at the brick, we can see evidence for previous changes. Obvious things like this one where a window's been blocked up, probably for the window tax, different size bricks, so the bed coursing doesn't line up with the sort of blocking, etc. Here, there's evidence for a change in the size of the windows. In fact, this building originally had a ground floor and first floor. It's now got ground, first and second floor, but the building's not been heightened. The floors have been moved around and the windows reduced in size. And you can see here, we've got a whole series of closures in the brickwork running right up to this point. And here you've got the springing for the brick arch for over the window. So this window's been reduced in size. Alongside it here, you can see a window that's been properly built. As the brickwork's been built, the window's been put in, and you can see a proper line of closures here in the brickwork. The window adjacent has been slotted in later, probably with an angle grinder, just slicing through the bricks anywhere, and the window inserted. So looking at the brickwork, one can begin to tell the story of the building. The bad effect, or the negative effect of repointing, again, can change tremendously the character of the building that you're looking at. In the corner here, this was very fine early 17th century handmade brickwork on a large grade 1 country house, and the local bricky's done a bit of repointing in the past, and it's totally changed the character of what was beautiful local handmade bricks. Again, we've got very fine polychrome brickwork here with vitrified headers and red bricks, and a couple of weeks later, strap pointing done, and it's changed the whole character of that piece of wall. And again here, a similar sort of situation. So it's worth looking closely at the brickwork, and sometimes the brickwork itself will, the way it's been pointed, will tell a story. Here we've got typical tuck pointing, very much sort of decayed now, but you can see how a poorer brickwork has been turned into quite a smart bit of brickwork by this applied pointing on the surface. Quite an expensive job as far as labour's concerned. Well, in the past, there was also simulated tuck pointing, the sort of cheaper version. And here you simply colour wash the whole of the brickwork out, you flush pointed, so basically you lost the pattern of brickwork. And then you either painted on the joints in this fashion, or you applied very thin pointing on the surface. And you can just see the residual pointing there on the surface. Well, of course, in both cases, one's now lost the effect of the tuck pointing or the simulated. You've now got sort of a modern repointing, which has changed completely effect. You can just see ghosting the original simulated tuck pointing. And rubbed brickwork, again, rubbed and gauged brickwork, very important on 18th century buildings. It first began to appear sort of in the Tudor period, but was very popular in 18th and the latter part of the 19th century on prestigious buildings. You got very, very fine. It was probably the height of the art of undertaking rubbed brickwork. Again, if it's badly repaired, it changes the whole character. Here you're seeing the colour of the brick, and the joints are very recessive. They're so tight, and so the effect, the impact, is large areas of sort of red brick rather than being disrupted by a joint pattern. Timber framing, again, there are regional traditions in timber framing, but also simply looking at the outside of the building, one can begin to unravel its history. Or whether it was built with an open hall in one section of the building. Windows again change through history. The whole design and style of the window, the major impact on change came towards the end of the 16th century. Prior to that, glass was extremely expensive for glazing windows. And it was only the movement of foreign craftsmen into this country, the Huguenot glass makers, onwards, bringing their craft with them, that meant that glass was readily towards the end of the 16th and into the 17th century. And this sort of revolutionized our glazing. And so here you can see development from the early casement windows of the 16th century with their metal casements through to the typical transom and mullion style of the 17th century. 18th century metal casements here, and then of course the 19th century with the timber casements. The position of the windows within the walls again changed and the whole of the window frame was flush with the face of the wall, but this was quite a fire risk. In 1709, the London building regulations required that windows should be set back at least on the face of the wall. And so the windows were set back. After the Great Fire of London, there was quite a lot of new regulations were brought out, and also in order to implement those regulations, building inspectors came in. So, you know, we think of those as sort of a 20th century phenomena, but in fact, building inspectors in places like London were there right from 1667 to regulate the systems of building, etc. Well, that helped a little with fire spread, flame spread, setting the windows back, but you still had a lot of timber work on the surface. And so in 1774, the building regulations required that not only were the windows set back, but also set within a reveal. And so you can see that the weight boxes disappeared completely within the brick structure. And this reduced tremendously the fire risk, the flame spread risk from the exterior of a building. But again, it's very slow to catch on. So this window here, again, is from Blandford Forum, and it's in a building of about 1740. And you've still got the window very much on the face of the building. And again, right at the end, to sort of set them back within the country areas. The other thing is to look particularly at the way that the windows are manufactured. The Georgian windows they had a very simple joint at the corners here, and you relied on the glazing bars helping, etc. When you get the advent of larger sheets of glazing, as the glass tax was reduced and then eventually came off, you had fewer glazing bars to stabilize your sash. And so they had to change the design of the joint in the corner here. And also this was much easier to do with machine making of window frames. And so we got the introduction of the horns. And what can sort of throw out the whole discussion is when sash windows, Georgian sash windows, have been replaced more recently, and they've been machine made and horns have been added. So that's, you know, an 18th century window opening with a 20th century replacement with horns. So it's distorting the story. So on repair or replacement of sashes, one needs to be very careful that you follow the original design for the period. In the 19th century, we've got other materials being introduced. From about 1810 onwards, you've got the use of cast iron producing your sash windows. And here you can see these cast frames, etc. And running right the way through to the end of the 19th century, you're getting these cast iron frames being quite popular. And again, there's a following of fashion, particularly with very decorative ones like this, sort of rather Gothic looking. Again, many of the large country estates adopted these as part of their sort of architectural uniqueness for their estate. And of course, the end of this sort of style comes with our crickle windows of the early 20th century, our steel-framed windows. We've also got horizontal sliding sash windows, which, as the name suggests, Yorkshire sashes were very common in the north of England, but we also find them in many of our southern villages and towns. And so here in the New Forest in Hampshire, we have a couple of examples here of horizontal sliding sashes from the 19th and early 20th century. Well, okay, we've looked at the actual windows themselves, their frames and surrounds, but glass is also very important. And the whole story of glass, I've done sort of a bit of a note for you for attaching to the recording of this session. But basically, glass begins to become more readily available in the middle of the 16th century. In 1567, the Privy Council gives a 21-year monopoly for Huguenot glassmakers to produce window glass. And a lot of them settled in the south of England. They came in through the ports of Southampton and other southern ports. And they headed for the forest because you needed timber for the furnaces and also for some of the raw materials and good silica sand. And in Hampshire, a whole group of Huguenots moved into the Forest of Beare, which is on the edge of Dorset and Hampshire. And by 1574, the burgesses of the city of Salisbury were complaining to the crown that these darned foreigners were burning every stick of decent timber, and there wasn't a decent beam for building houses for 10 miles distance. So you can see how rapidly they changed the shape of our countryside in producing vast quantities of glass. Eventually they finished up in the Midlands, where they learned that the 1815, James I banned the use of timber for firing furnaces, and coal exclusively became used in the glass production. And so very important to retain early glass. The earlier glass, tremendous sort of distorted reflections, etc., and compare it with sort of modern glass, float glass, where you're getting sort of deadpan reflections, and horror of horrors, the more recent sticky lead on a sheet of glass changes completely the character of the building. And here we've got sort of modern float glass, which certainly from the sort of 1960s onwards, you're getting this super clear, highly finished glass, which doesn't have any distortions, and so no character whatsoever. Well, the early glass making was done in the forests, as I mentioned, and quite often the sands that were being used had all sorts of inclusions of particularly iron traces in the sand, and this gave sort of brown and greenish tinges to the glass. And so again, very important to retain this. Even if the lights are re-leaded, it's important to stipulate that the glass is recovered and reused. Well, as we go through into the 18th century, there were other methods of producing glass. You could spin it as a disc here and have this crown glass with, you can recognize it with sort of these radiating lines from the center and these sort of interesting distortions. And also in the 18th century, cylinder glass was developed, where you basically blew an elongated bubble, swinging it over a pit to get this sort of long cylinder. You cut off the top and the bottom, cut down the length of it, put it on a flat surface and heated and annealed it, so it opened up as a sheet of glass. Whenever you're using crowns for making glass or casting glass, you're restricted to very small quarries of glass. Once you get into the production of cylinder glass, you can have larger sheets of glass, and this really heralded the sash windows with the larger panes. Well, the government realised that glass was a very useful source of revenue, and from 1696, window tax was levied on buildings, and this continued right the way through to 1851, where you were taxed on the number of windows. But also they realised that they could tax glass as well, and so in 1745, there was an excise tax on glass by weight. And so the glass makers produced the thinnest possible window glass they could, as it was by weight. And so this is why we find in many original Georgian windows, our glass is probably only 2 or possibly 3 millimeters thick. It was because it was taxed by weight. And it was only in 1845 that the glass tax was eventually repealed. And, you know, it's important to get, you know, the right sort of glass in the windows. From the middle of the 19th century onwards, machine-made glass was being produced. This is drawn glass, and you still get quite a bit of distortion in one plane. And so, again, you've got a little bit of liveliness with the glass. Modern glass, float glass, what can you do? Well, someone had the bright idea of annealing it on a slightly cushioned plate, so that you got this, which is really sort of, you know, Disneyland historic glass. It looks appalling. Well, glass can also tell us about probably the status and original use of buildings, and where, particularly in the 19th century, you know, glass was still expensive, etc. Offcuts of it were used in the sort of workshop in industrial buildings. And so here you can see what had been a blacksmith shop in the village. It's now a garage to this large house. But the windows here are very typical of offcuts of glass, just simply overlapping by an inch or so, and glazed into these long, thin lights. And again, this is the carpenter's shop at Wealdon Downland Open Air Museum, with a typical village carpenter's shop with this form of glazing. Fan lights, again, show status and wealth on our historic, particularly Georgian buildings, and you get a whole sort of range of them. The finer the detail, the more expensive they were. And something like this, which is virtually sort of a cobweb of tracery, quite often they used for producing this sort of highly decorative fan light. And the lower the status, the plainer it gets, the lights to the main door. Why do we need fan lights? Well, we've got the loss of the big sort of reception hall. They now become sort of poky little spaces, usually without even a window. So the only way of getting lighting, natural lighting into those hall spaces were by the fan light, or later people punched out the top panels in the 6-panel doors and glazed them to get a bit of light into the entrance hall. And so here you can see that situation with these glazed top panels. And again, the door cases can tell a story as far as both period and status. And gradually, as you come down through the social status, the door cases, and also the way that the panel doors are created, with the field and panel doors being sort of the most expensive, coming down to these very plain panel doors here, where they're flush panels, and of course down to the lowly cottage with its planked door. Porches, again, indication of fashion and time, from the some of the highly sort of classical style, very shallow porches of the late Georgian period, through the Victorian period into the sorts of arts and crafts period with sort of highly decorative late 19th century, and then into the 20th century with sort of our Art Deco styles coming in, with both the doors and the porch details being of the period. And again, it would be very easy to lose this very distinctive door through sort of replacements with a, you know, a modern double glazed plastic thing. Balconies and ironwork, again, we need to keep what we've still got. A lot of it went during the war, for the war effort, was melted down. Where we've got it in some areas, it's highly distinctive, it's a highly regional, distinctive material. Again, in the earlier period, in the Georgian period, it tends to be wrought iron. By the time we get into the early 19th century, the local foundries are diversifying into architectural ironwork, and many of these pieces have got the names of the foundries cast into them. And so again, an important feature to retain. Smaller things like lamp and sign brackets, again, of their story to tell. This one with the 3 hanging points, the former use of this shop, pawnbroker. Here we've got a cast iron bracket that was for a lamp. So the lamp lighter would have come around and lit a lamp on the end of this bracket. Pub signs, again, very distinctive. And rainwater goods from the earlier sort of 17th and earlier 18th century ones in lead, cast lead, to the cast iron ones of the 19th century, quite often with the estate owner's coat of arms on them and so on. And don't forget the humble fire sign here. This is the Sun Insurance fire sign. These again have become collector's items, and it's a great shame to see the ghost of where they were on the outside of some historic buildings where they've been peeled off and turned into cash. Very much a little detail that's important to retain. In the 19th century, tiled paths, entrance paths to your house became very much in vogue, particularly with the Victorian and Edwardian villas on the suburbs. You know, you could have your best Axminster carpet inside, but the passing public didn't see that. You know, your visitor, as they stepped onto your path with these highly decorative Minton tiles, you know, it showed your status and wealth and place in society. And so you can get the very ornate ones down to the, you know, the poor man's entry with the just plain red tiles. So again, very easily lost these days, particularly where people are turning their forecourts into parking places. Quickly on to doors and fittings. The earliest doors were planked doors. Sometimes they were double planked. So you got vertical planks on the outside, horizontal planks on the inside, and nails through with the nails bent over. Eventually, you reduce the number of horizontal planks on the inside, and you finish up with ledged doors. And then by the time we're getting into the 19th century, we're getting the ledged and braced doors, and sometimes they're framed as well to make them even stronger. So you've got a whole sort of hierarchy of development and also development, technical development in the door. And again, you can see here facsimiles of late medieval doors at the Wiggle and Downward Outlaw Museum, and also the window shutters. When we get into the latter part of the 17th century and into the 18th century, panel doors become very popular, and they're made up of a number of components with mortise and tenon joints in them, so they're quite strong. The shape of the panel changes, the number of panels, and also the way that they're put together. And there's a whole sort of hierarchy of the door. So you can see here we've got internal doors from the 17th into the early 18th century, the plank type door to the 17th century door, and you can see here the decoration on this high status panel, and you can see the way it was a plain panel that's then had the decoration applied. This is typical of the late 17th century. Then as we get into the 18th century, we've got, the 6-panel door is very popular. And there's a whole hierarchy of door within a single Georgian building. Usually on the ground floor, you've got the best raised and field 6-panel doors with these wide architraves around. As you go up to the first floor, sort of bedroom level, you drop down to sort of 4-panel doors, and then up at attic, sort of servants level, you're quite often down to 2-panel doors. Sorry. In the 19th century, you get the use of much more use of sort of softwoods in the production of doors, and to make them sort of higher status than they really are, graining became very popular. So you could simulate sort of oak, or you could veneer with things like burr walnut, etc., to give you a very high status looking door on a cheap carcass. And this even sort of filtered down to sort of a much lower level, much lower domestic door that has been grained in the past. And then, this is part of the story. In the 1960s, obviously, the do-it-yourself owner read the right magazine or watched the guy on telly all about panelling, doing a flush panel. So we've got a hardboard panel with a bit of beading round covering this rather fine Victorian grain door. So amazing what's sort of hidden away. The other thing to look for are hinges and architraves, these much wider architraves of the 18th century, very typical Georgian profiles to them. Hinges with panel doors, the weak spot were these corner joints, and so you had the development of the HL hinge with this strap, metal strap coming out in this direction to strengthen that corner joint. So very much goes with the 18th century high quality panel doors. Architraves change as you get into the 19th century. Quite often you get these sort of reeded surrounds with a decorative floret in the corner. Quite often these are moulded material, moulded plaster or gesso to produce this sort of decorative piece. Bolts and hinges, again, change through time, and as I say, I mentioned the L-shape, LH hinges. The strap hinge, the T hinge, was popular right through history, from the medieval period onwards, right through into the 19th century. And here you can see on this door an original 18th century one with the B&Q version beneath. So, this particular T-hinge carries on through history. And the straightforward H-shaped hinge, but quite often with sort of decorative finials to the hinge. Other door furniture to look out for are sort of locks, the chain's linked even if the chain itself's gone. And clasps, locks and latches. Again, there's a whole sort of historic development of these from the and also status from the lowly sort of timber latch through to these quite fine blacksmith made and sort of the cast ones of the 19th century, and locks themselves from the wooden lock case with its metal banding to strengthen it from the late 17th century through to the high sort of status end. This is by royal appointment. This is a Brahma lock, so the highest status of all on your front door. Shutters and ironwork appertaining to shutters. Again, quite often the shutters themselves are missing, but you'll see evidence for them in the way of catches and the sort of system of locking with bars or a wooden sort of bolt across running from a hook, a hasp, sorry, again, I'll start again. A staple at one end and a basic hook at the other to hook your bar in for security. Window catches and glazing bars, again, change through time. And there's a whole sort of paper written on, you know, the development of the cast brass sash lock. A whole series of different manufacturers produce them with their own particular style. You've also got then in the sort of arts and crafts period, some highly sort of decorative ones copying early 16th and 17th century examples. So all very important in the small detail one's looking at. The glazing bars again, they change from quite bold them down to, in the early 19th century, you're down to sort of about half-inch section with the very fine glazing bars. Panelling and other wall coverings, just very quickly. Panelling, the way that was produced was usually by the flat panels themselves, by riving the oak. You're actually splitting it down the grain. The surround to the panel was usually done by basically axing the timber square and then slicing it into sections with a pips. The size and style of the panelling changed through time. You'll find you know, that in quite a lot of published sources. Some of the earliest, highly decorative, was the linen fold panel, but in ordinary houses you simply have the plain panelling. And don't think of it simply as being plain oak. Quite often it was painted and decorated, and here you can see you know, high status panelling with decoration with your family's coat of arms going through the past. By the time we're getting into the 17th century, we've moved away from the small panels to the much larger panels because timber was beginning to become available, quite fine hardwoods from elsewhere. Look out for reused panelling from the 16th and 17th century where it doesn't quite fit the rooms and it's been bodged in the corners. Here you can see quite clearly it doesn't link through. This bit of softwood's been stained down to sort of marry the two areas of panelling. And again, you can see bits being added. And also look at the way the panelling is in the room. It should have just a straight plain chamfer on the bottom of the panel here, on the bottom style, with the moulded going around the three sides. This was so that you didn't gather dust on the bottom with a moulded section. And quite often I've seen it on its side, upside down, etc., being reused in interiors. And again, it can be quite decorative. These are examples of 17th century actually found in a barn. By the time we get to the 18th century, we're well and truly into large panels. These are quite often softwood deal panels made up of sort of multiple planks, and then they are painted over and grained to simulate oak. So again, it's sort of keeping up with the Joneses. By the time we get into the 19th, latter part of the 19th century, panelling is back again in arts and crafts buildings, usually with quite fine colours, sort of mute colours of paint, and also little sort of decorative friezes, sort of reflecting sort of 17th century decoration. Paint effects were very popular in the 18th and early 19th century, not only graining, which is quite an art, but also marbling. These are timber panels simulated to look like marbling, and this could be used to great effect in interiors. Here we can see this interior. In fact, it's flat walls, and this is all paint effect. It's not three-dimensional work at all. So these apparent pilasters and panels, you know, with these are painted shadow lines on them, etc. And again, the marbling, it's timber that's been made to look like marbling. So, you know, look out for that sort of thing. Wall coverings, the way to get over sort of that damp area in the basement where your servants lived was to timber it out, frame it out, then spread stretch hessian across, and then sort of a basic wallpaper or paint on top. And so again, look out for this sort of survival, particularly in the lower status areas of your larger buildings. Wallpapers, again, can tell a story. Here's just a selection from the latter part of the 19th century. These are all you know, very typical of the period, hand block printed, sort of arts and crafts movement, William Morris, from sort of the William Morris stable, but there are quite a few different. And the nice thing is that you can get pattern books from this period, which sort of help you to sort of date the wallpaper. So it's quite interesting where people are restoring a building to actually look at the stratigraphy of wallpaper going back probably into the 1850s. Floors, again, change through time. The way that they're put together, either butt jointed, half lapped, tongued and grooved, but also in the 18th century, we get other ways of putting them together. Here, you've got edge pegging, and this has been sanded and finished so many times, they're actually down now to the edge pegging of these boards together. Also floor finishes. Yes, you've got the plain boarding here, but this sort of strange greenish tinge to it. Beware, the green staining was produced by an arsenic-based stain. So yeah, don't rub your fingers and lick them when you're looking at this sort of finish. Also, sort of block flooring of various styles, very typical from the middle of the 19th century onwards. Very difficult to sort of retain and repair. And here's a good example of how not to do it with sort of new parquet floor blending into the old. It's quite a poor quality job. The skirtings, cornices, picture rails, again, historically, the mouldings change through time. The height of the skirting boards are all pointing out status. Basically, the taller the skirting board, the higher the status usually of the building. Picture rails, very popular in the 19th century, and then in the early 20th century, in the lower status building, sort of paint in the frieze section here a different colour, and also your cornicing, you know, became readily available in packs fibrous plaster for easy application. And again, you know, mouldings, very important when repairs are being done to pick up the right sort of shape and style and size of mouldings. Staircases, medieval staircases were quite simple, with these squared timbers being cut on a diagonal and then pegged to a stretcher here to produce a very simple staircase. It's sort of one up on a ladder, but as we then move into the 16th, late 16th and 17th century, the staircase again becomes a vehicle for showing your social status. And you know, the more highly turned and moulded, the higher the status. By the time you get down to sort of the low end, you're getting these very simple splats, and here, you know, with straight sort of plain slats in between, you're sort of right at the bottom status. You're scraping the barrel here for sort of decorative finish on your staircase. Fireplaces. Fireplaces of the 16th and 17th century tended to be sort of plain brick surrounds with brick arch. Ignore the 20th century infill here. By the time we're getting into the 18th century, we're getting marble surrounds and very simple sort of cast iron inserts like this one here, very simple grates. Through the 19th century, we get in the introduction of much more decorative cast iron work with decorative tiles. Quite often these are painted over to sort of modernize the fire opening. Again, in the 1970s, 60s and 70s, you found many of these in a skip along the roadside. Today you can go into B&Q and buy a nice facsimile one to slot in where it was ripped out in the 70s. Social history very easily lost when particularly sort of country farmhouses have been modernised, etc. Beautiful time capsule here from the 19th century with its coppers, etc. You can just imagine someone coming in and wanting to turn this into a modern kitchen with you know, its fixtures, etc. So these very, very important to record as passing history and do what you can to try and save them. And you know, finally, those abandoned attic areas, particularly in towns above shops where only the ground floor is really productive. First floor might be let out as a flat. Attics, you know, even the access into the roof space tended to be boarded over. And here quite often you can see a time capsule of the 18th century still surviving. So, yeah, important to sort of note these details, to try and safeguard them, and, you know, fall back on legislation. Yeah, you can't really believe that, you know, this is a listed terrace here and what's happened in the past. You know, the original windows surviving here, lost their glazing, but still at least, you know, the original sort of shape and style of sash window with the plastic alongside. And it always grieves me to see perfectly fine Victorian timber sash windows with no rot in them at all being replaced by temporary plastic that might last for 20 years. And of course, you know, quality windows and what's going in and what's coming out alongside, you know, is a real horror story. Okay, so much for, I'll stop sharing.
Well,
back to our driver.